They say you can't hear a heartbreak. But on the afternoon the Vance ranch was put up for auction, the silence was loud enough to shatter glass. It was the kind of party where the champagne flowed like water and the handshakes felt cold. Colonel Harlan Vance, a man who had spent 70 years building a fortress around his pride, stood on his porch watching the vultures circle. Bankers, developers, investors, men in three-piece suits waiting to pick the meat off the bones of his family legacy. They thought it was just a sale. They thought it was just land. They were wrong. Because just as the auctioneer raised his gavel to sell off the last acre, the heavy iron gates swung open. She wasn't on the guest list. She looked like something the Montana wind had dragged in, wearing denim so worn it was almost white, and boots that had seen more miles than most of the luxury cars parked in the driveway combined. The security guards moved to stop her, assuming she was a beggar, assuming she was a mistake. But she didn't stop. She walked straight through the sea of tuxedos and designer dresses like they were ghosts. She walked right up to the billionaire standing on the porch, and she didn't say a word. She reached into her pocket. The crowd gasped, expecting a weapon. Instead, she pulled out a battered, scratched-up silver Zippo lighter. She placed it gently on the linen tablecloth in front of Harlan Vance. Clack. That small, cheap sound stopped a billion-dollar transaction dead in its tracks. Because Harlan knew that lighter. He had thrown it at his son's feet 20 years ago, the night he disowned him. He looked at the girl. He looked at the lighter. And for the first time in 2 decades, the great Colonel Vance looked afraid. Not of losing his money, but of the truth standing right in front of him. "Who are you?" he whispered. Though deep down, in the place where his conscience had been rotting for 20 years, he already knew. "I didn't come for your money, Colonel," the girl said, her voice shaking with a rage she was barely holding back. "I came to give you back the only thing you ever gave my father." The dust of Montana didn't care about Italian leather, yet there was plenty of both at the Vance ranch that afternoon. A fleet of black SUVs and silver Bentleys lined the gravel driveway, looking like polished beetles invading a lion's den. The air smelled of expensive cologne, roasted prime rib, and the impending death of a legacy. Colonel Harlan Vance stood on the wraparound porch of the main house, gripping a glass of bourbon tightly enough to threaten the crystal. At 70, Harlan was still a mountain of a man, though time had eroded the edges. He wore his Stetson low, shadowing eyes that were the color of cold steel, eyes that had stared down blizzards, wild stallions, and bankruptcy. Today, however, they were staring at the end of his world. "They're ready for the opening toast, Harlan." A voice greased with false enthusiasm came from his left. Harlan didn't turn. He knew it was Bradley, his son-in-law. Bradley was a man who wore suits that were too tight and smiles that didn't reach his eyes. He was the one who had brokered this deal, the one who had whispered in Harlan's ear for 2 years that the ranch was a money pit, that the developer's offer was a lifeline. "Let them wait," Harlan rumbled. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "Vultures don't need a dinner bell." Bradley chuckled nervously, checking his gold Rolex. "Come on now. These aren't vultures. They're investors. This auction is going to set the family up for 3 generations. You should be proud." "Proud," Harlan repeated the word as if it tasted like ash. He looked out over the 3,000 acres of rolling pastures, turning gold in the late afternoon sun. This land had been in the Vance name since 1880. Tonight, under the gavel, it would be chopped up into parcels for luxury condos and a golf course. "Just get it over with," Harlan muttered, finally turning his back on the horizon. Below the porch, on the manicured lawn, 200 guests mingled. It was a sea of silk dresses and tuxedos. a bubbling noise of polite laughter and clinking glasses. Security guards in dark blazers stood at the perimeter, looking bored. Then, the rhythm of the party broke. It started near the main iron gates, a ripple of silence that spread inward, silencing conversations, row by row. Heads turned. A woman in a pearl necklace gasped audibly, clutching her husband's arm. Harlan narrowed his eyes, looking over the rim of his glass. Walking up the center of the driveway, straight through the heart of the gala, was a figure that didn't belong. It was a girl, no older than 19 or 20. She wasn't wearing silk or satin. She wore a denim jacket that had been bleached white by the sun and scrubbed thin at the elbows. Her jeans were stained with oil and red dirt, tucked into leather work boots that were cracked from heavy use. She walked with a stride that was long and purposeful, ignoring the gasps, ignoring the disgusted looks of the socialites who parted ways to let her pass. She looked like a ghost from the ranch's past, a reminder of the sweat and grit that had built this place before the money moved in. "Security," Bradley hissed, stepping forward to the railing. "What are those idiots doing? Get her out of here." A large security guard intercepted the girl near the fountain. He reached out to grab her arm, his body language aggressive. The crowd watched, expecting a scene, expecting the intruder to cower. She didn't cower. She didn't even stop. As the guard's hand closed on her shoulder, she spun with a fluid, practiced motion, twisting her body and breaking his grip with a sharp, disciplined jolt. She said something to him, low, fierce, and final. The guard froze, looking confused, rubbing his wrist. She kept walking. She was heading straight for the porch. Straight for Harlan. "Unbelievable," Bradley spat, his face flushing red. "I'll handle this." He started down the stairs, waving his arms. "Hey, you, this is private property. You're trespassing on a closed estate." The girl stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Up close, the travel fatigue was visible on her face. Her skin was tanned from working outdoors, her dark hair pulled back in a messy knot. But it was her eyes that stopped Harlan's heart in his chest. They were green, a fierce, intelligent, defiant green with flecks of gold. Bradley reached the bottom step, looming over her. "Did you hear me? I said get out before I have you arrested for vagrancy. Go back to whatever trailer park you crawled out of." The girl looked at Bradley, then slowly shifted her gaze up to the porch, locking eyes with the old man standing in the shadows of the eaves. The silence in the garden was absolute now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I'm not here for the party," she said. Her voice was raspy, dry from the road, but it carried across the lawn with piercing clarity. "And I'm not here for your money." Harlan felt his grip on the glass loosen. His fingers went numb. He took a slow, heavy step forward, moving into the sunlight. "Then what do you want?" Harlan asked, his voice booming over the crowd. The girl reached into the pocket of her dirty jacket. The security guards tense, hands moving to their belts. But she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a battered silver Zippo lighter. She held it up, the metal catching the dying sun. "I came to return this," she said, her green eyes burning into his. "And to meet my grandfather." The word hung in the air, heavier than the heat, sharper than the whiskey. Grandfather. Bradley laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Grandfather? Oh, that's rich. That is a new low. Listen to me, you little scam artist." "Shut up, Bradley," Harlan said. It wasn't a shout, but the command was absolute. Harlan stared at the lighter. Even from this distance, he recognized the engraving. He had commissioned it 20 years ago for his son, Austin. He had thrown it at Austin's feet the night he kicked him out for marrying a waitress. The night he told his only son he was dead to this family. The girl stood her ground, looking small against the massive house, but casting a shadow that seemed to stretch all the way to Harlan's soul. "Who are you?" Harlan whispered, though he already knew. He knew it in the way his blood suddenly ran cold and hot all at once. "My name is Cassidy," she said. "Cassidy Vance. And we need to talk before you sell my father's home." The name Vance didn't just float into the air. It landed like an accusation. Harlan descended the porch steps slowly, his cane thumping against the wood with a heavy, rhythmic finality. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the auctioneers who were nervously checking their watches. He looked only at the girl. "My son is dead," Harlan said. His voice was devoid of emotion, a dry riverbed where water had ceased to flow 20 years ago. He died in a collision on Route 90 before he ever had the chance to beg for forgiveness. So, unless you're a medium or a con artist, you're in the wrong place, girl. "I didn't say he was alive," Cassidy replied, her voice steady, though her hands, rough, calloused hands, trembled slightly at her sides. "I said I'm his daughter." Bradley stepped between them, his expensive cologne suddenly cloying in the open air. Panic was beginning to sweat through his dress shirt. He could see the guests whispering, pulling out their phones. The narrative of the perfect sale was unraveling. "This is insane," Bradley announced, turning to the crowd with a forced, incredulous smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. The local grifters seem to think a funeral is a lottery ticket." He turned back to Cassidy, his face twisting into a sneer that only she could see. "You think you can just walk in here with a sob story? I know your type. You probably scoped the guest list online." He signaled to the security team again, more frantically this time. "Get her out, now, and check her pockets. I saw her bumping into Mr. Henderson earlier. She's likely lifted a wallet or two." It was a lie, sharp and desperate, designed to turn the girl from a curiosity into a criminal. A murmur of suspicion rippled through the guests. The sympathy in the air evaporated, replaced by the instinctive defensiveness of the wealthy. Cassidy didn't flinch at the accusation. She didn't scream or defend herself. She simply reached out to a nearby high-top table, draped in white linen and holding a half-empty glass of champagne. With a deliberate, heavy movement, she placed the silver Zippo lighter on the table. The metallic clack was soft, but in the hush of the garden, it sounded like a gunshot. "Check the bottom," Cassidy said, her eyes never leaving Harlan's. Bradley reached for it. "I'm taking this as evidence." "Don't touch it," Harlan roared. The ferocity of the command stopped Bradley mid-motion. The old man stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. He stared at the lighter. It was battered, scratched deep on one side, as if it had been dropped on asphalt many times. But the silver still shone. With a shaking hand, Harlan picked it up. His thumb brushed over the engraving, worn smooth by worry and time. "To Austin, find your way home." Harlan closed his eyes. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, the smell of rain, the slamming of a truck door, the last time he had seen his son's back as he drove away from this very house. He never lost it, Harlan whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He pawned his watch, he pawned his guitar, but he never pawned this. "He used it to light campfires," Cassidy said softly, "when we didn't have anywhere else to sleep. He told me it was the only thing he owned that proved he used to be someone." "Lies," Bradley cut in, sensing the old man's resolve cracking. She could have bought that at a pawn shop. She could have stolen it from Austin's grave. Harlan, look at her. Look at the clothes. She's looking for a payout. If you acknowledge her, the auction stops. The investors walk. We lose everything. Cassidy ignored him. She reached into her jacket again. This time she pulled out a leather-bound book. The cover was stained with coffee and water, the binding held together by duct tape. I don't want your money, she repeated, her voice hardening. I came because he asked me to. He didn't want you to be alone when the wolves came. She glanced at Bradley. And he knew they would come. She held the book out, not to Harlan, but to the gray-haired man standing silently by the punch bowl, Arthur Miller, the family's attorney for 40 years. Mr. Miller, Cassidy said, page 42. Miller blinked, surprised that she knew his name. He stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles, and took the book as if it were a holy relic. He opened it, the pages crinkling in the dry air. Read it, Cassidy commanded. Miller cleared his throat. He looked at the handwriting, a messy, sprawling scrawl that he hadn't seen in 2 decades. His breath hitched. It's dated October 14th, 5 years ago, Miller said. He looked up at Harlan, his expression grave. The day you had your heart surgery, Harlan. Harlan stiffened. No one outside the immediate family knew the exact date. Miller began to read aloud, his voice trembling. I drove down to the ridge today. Parked the truck behind the old mill so no one would see. Used the binoculars. I saw the ambulance leave the main house. I saw Dad. They were loading him onto the stretcher. He looked so small. I wanted to run down there. I wanted to tell him I was sorry. But I promised Cassidy I wouldn't make a scene. I promised her I'd just watch. So I sat on the hood of the truck and prayed to a God I don't believe in, asking him to let the stubborn old bastard live another day. Because if he dies without knowing he has a granddaughter, I've failed them both. Miller stopped reading. He closed the book slowly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of 20 years of pride and anger crumbling into dust. Harlan stood frozen. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw the shape of his son's jawline, the stubborn set of her chin. He saw the poverty she wore like armor, and beneath it, the dignity she wielded like a sword. Bradley, sensing the tide turning violently against him, made one last desperate move. He lunged for the book in Miller's hands. Give me that. It's a forgery. It's... Thwack. Harlan didn't hesitate. He swung his cane backhanded, striking Bradley across the chest. It wasn't a lethal blow, but the shock of it sent the younger man stumbling backward into a waiter, sending a tray of crystal flutes crashing to the stone patio. One more word, Harlan snarled, his voice low and dangerous, the voice of the man who had once broken wild horses with his bare hands. One more word about my family, Bradley, and I will bury you where you stand. Harlan turned back to Cassidy. He didn't smile. He couldn't. The grief was too fresh, too raw. He simply extended a hand, his palm open, inviting her into the space he had guarded so fiercely for so long. Let me see your arm, he said hoarsely. Cassidy hesitated, then rolled up the sleeve of her denim jacket. There, running from her wrist to her elbow, was a jagged, pale scar. Harlan rolled up his own sleeve, revealing a nearly identical mark on his weathered forearm. Barbed wire? He asked. Trying to fence the south pasture in the dark, she answered. Dad said we needed to secure the perimeter. He taught you well, Harlan whispered. Tears, hot and unbidden, finally spilled onto his cheeks. He taught you better than I ever taught him. The sun had begun to dip below the Sawtooth Mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawn. The auctioneer, a man paid to talk fast and think faster, stood frozen on his podium, his gavel hanging uselessly in the air. The silence that followed Harlan's embrace of his granddaughter was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of air pressure that precedes a tornado. Harlan pulled away from Cassidy, wiping his face with the back of a weathered hand. He looked at the scar on her arm one last time, then straightened his spine. The grief was still there, but something else had ignited behind his eyes, the old fire that had built this empire. He turned to the crowd. He didn't need a microphone. "Go home," Harlan barked. The investors and socialites blinked, confused. A man in a pinstripe suit stepped forward. "Mr. Vance, we have contracts prepared. The bidding was about to open at $50 million. The auction is canceled." Harlan cut him off. "The land is not for sale, not today, not ever." "You can't do this." Bradley scrambled up from where he had fallen, his shirt stained with grass and wine. "Harlan, the banknotes are due on the 1st. If we don't sell, they take everything. You're throwing away a fortune." Harlan looked at his son-in-law with a terrifying calmness. "I'd rather let the bank burn the house down than let you sell another inch of it." He gestured to the security team, the same men who had tried to remove Cassidy minutes ago. "Escort these people off my property, all of them. Especially him." He pointed a finger at Bradley. As the chaotic exodus began, engines revving, insults muttered, tires crunching on gravel, Harlan turned his full attention to the girl. He looked at her worn-out boots, the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes, the thinness of her frame that the bulky jacket couldn't hide. He saw the poverty, and in his mind, he saw a simple solution. He was a Vance. Vances fixed problems with checks and land deeds. "Come inside," Harlan said, his voice softening, though it still held the weight of command. "I'll have the chef prepare something. You look like you haven't eaten a hot meal in a week." "I ate yesterday," Cassidy said, her voice flat. She didn't move toward the house. "Don't be stubborn," Harlan said. "We have business to discuss. If you are Austin's daughter, then you are my heir. The lawyers will draw it up tonight. This ranch, the livestock, the mineral rights, it's all yours. It's your birthright." He waited for the gratitude. He waited for the relief to wash over her face. He expected her to cry, to thank him, to ask how much it was all worth. Instead, Cassidy laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound, devoid of humor. She looked around at the sprawling mansion, at the marble fountains and the freshly cut grass that cost a fortune to water in a drought. Then she looked back at him, and her expression was one of profound pity. "I don't want it," she said. Harlan frowned, confused. "You don't understand. This is $100 million in assets. You'll never have to work again. You can live like a queen." "I didn't come here for a payout, Harlan," Cassidy said, using his first name. It stripped away his title, his authority. "I came to bring the lighter back. That's it. My job is done." She turned to leave, her boots scraping against the stone patio. "Stop!" Harlan called out. He stepped in front of her, desperate now. "Why? You're clearly struggling, girl. I can see it. Why would you walk away from this?" Cassidy stopped. She took a deep breath, and for a moment, the tough exterior cracked. Her shoulders slumped. "Because my mother is dying," she said quietly. The words hit Harlan like a physical blow. He remembered the waitress, Sarah, the woman he had called a gold digger, the woman he had offered $10,000 to disappear 20 years ago. She has a heart condition, Cassidy continued, staring at the ground. She needs a valve replacement. We don't have insurance. We sold the truck last month to pay for her meds. Then let me pay for it, Harlan practically shouted, reaching for his checkbook inside his jacket. I can fly her to the best specialist in Seattle. I can cover the surgery, the recovery, everything. Just tell me where she is. Cassidy looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set in stone. No. Why? Harlan pleaded, his hands shaking. It's money. It's just money. Why would you let her suffer when I can fix it with a signature? Because she made me promise, Cassidy said, her voice trembling with the effort of holding back tears. Before I left, she made me swear on Dad's grave. She said, Cassie, you go there, you return his father's keepsake, and you walk away. We do not take his money. We do not let him buy his way out of his guilt. Cassidy stepped closer to the old man. She's working double shifts at a diner with a failing heart, Harlan. She is in pain every single day. But she told me that her pride, the pride of the woman you called trash, is the only thing she has left that you can't buy. And she would rather die on her feet than live on your knees. Harlan stood paralyzed. The checkbook felt like lead in his pocket. He had spent his life believing that every person had a price, that respect could be purchased, that legacy was about acres and bank accounts. Now, standing before a girl with $10 in her pocket, he realized he was the poorest man on earth. Cassidy adjusted her jacket. Goodbye, Mr. Vance. I hope you find peace. Because money sure hasn't bought you any. She turned and began the long walk down the driveway, a solitary figure against the purple twilight, leaving the billionaire alone in his castle. Silence in a house that big has a sound of its own. It hums in the walls, echoes in the empty hallways, and settles like dust on the furniture. Harlan stood on the patio long after Cassidy had disappeared into the darkness. The guests were gone. The catering trucks had packed up. The security guards had retreated to the gatehouse. For the first time in 40 years, Harlan Vance was completely, terrifyingly alone. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Not from age, but from the adrenaline crash of a man who realizes he has spent 2 decades building a monument to a lie. He had protected his fortune, yes, but he had lost his soul. He walked back into the house, but he didn't go to his study. He didn't pour another drink. Instead, he went to the mudroom by the back door. He bypassed the row of polished dress shoes and pulled on a pair of old, scuffed work boots he hadn't worn since Austin was a teenager. He grabbed his keys, not for the Bentley, but for the rusting 1988 Ford F-150 he kept in the back barn, the truck he used to teach Austin to drive. He drove. He drove away from the iron gates, away from the pristine asphalt of the estate and onto the county highway. He drove for 3 hours, crossing the invisible line that separated the Montana of the rich from the Montana of the working poor. The landscape changed. The fences sagged. The houses shrank. The neon signs of luxury resorts were replaced by flickering lights of 24-hour laundromats and roadside diners. He found the hospital in a town called Libby. It was a brick block of a building that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Harlan walked to the reception desk. He was still wearing his tuxedo trousers, but with the old work boots and a dusty jacket. The nurse looked at him with skepticism. But something in his eyes, the sheer, desperate intensity of them, made her answer his question. Room 304. The walk down the hallway felt longer than any cattle drive he had ever led. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a stark, unforgiving white. He heard the beep of monitors, the murmur of prayers, the silence of waiting. When he reached the door, he stopped. He took off his Stetson hat, holding it against his chest with both hands. He wasn't the colonel here. He wasn't a billionaire. He was just a father who had run out of time. He pushed the door open. The room was small and dim. Cassidy was asleep in a plastic chair in the corner, her head resting on her arms, looking impossibly young. And in the bed lay Sarah. Harlan hadn't seen her in 20 years. The last time, she had been a terrified 20-year-old girl with fire in her eyes, screaming at him that she loved his son. Now, she was a woman worn thin by life. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow and labored. But even in sleep, her face held a hardness, a resolve that reminded him instantly of the girl who had stormed his party. The creak of the door woke Cassidy. She jerked up, her eyes wide, ready to fight. When she saw Harlan, her expression hardened. "I told you," she whispered harshly, standing up to block the bed. "We don't want your money." "I didn't bring any," Harlan said softly. He walked past her, moving slowly toward the bed. Cassidy tensed, but she didn't stop him. Harlan stood over the woman who had loved his son when he had refused to. He looked at the lines on her face, every one of them a testament to a struggle he had caused. Sarah's eyes fluttered open. It took her a moment to focus. When she saw the old man standing over her, she didn't gasp. She didn't panic. She simply watched him with a weary, ancient calm. "You got old, Harlan," she rasped. Her voice was weak, but the spirit was intact. "I got old," Harlan agreed, his voice cracking. "And I got foolish." He slowly lowered himself. The billionaire, the land baron, the man who never bowed to anyone, sank to his knees on the cold hospital linoleum. He placed his hat on the floor and bowed his head until his forehead rested against the metal rail of her bed. "I killed him," Harlan whispered, the confession tearing out of his throat. "I didn't drive the car, but I drove him away. I let him die thinking he had no father, and I let you live thinking you had no family." The room was silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. "I cannot buy your forgiveness," Harlan said, tears dripping onto the floor. "I know that now. A check won't fix a broken heart. But Sarah, please, do not let my pride kill you too. Let me help, not as a charity, but as a grandfather who wants to know the only piece of his son left in this world." He looked up at her, his eyes red and raw. "I am begging you. Let me save the only thing I have left to save." Sarah looked at him for a long time. She looked at Cassidy, who was watching with wide, wet eyes. Then she looked back at the old man kneeling on the floor. She saw the defeat in him. She saw the father Austin had always wanted him to be. Slowly, painfully, she reached out her hand. Her fingers, thin and trembling, brushed against Harlan's white hair. "He loved you," she whispered. "Even at the end, he loved you." Harlan broke. He buried his face in his hands and wept. A lifetime of stoicism washing away in the sterile light of room 304. 5 years later, the sign at the main gate no longer said private property. It was a hand-carved wooden arch that read, "The Vance and Cole Rehabilitation Center." The morning sun hit the pastures of the Montana Valley, turning the dew into a field of diamonds. The silence of the estate was gone, replaced by the sounds of life. There was the rhythmic thud of hooves, the laughter of children, the sharp whistle of trainers. In the south paddock, a group of veterans, men and women with scars, both visible and invisible, were learning to saddle horses. They moved with cautious hands, learning to trust something again. Harlan leaned against the fence, watching them. At 75, he moved a little slower, and he wore flannel shirts now instead of suits. He watched a young soldier gently stroke the nose of a skittish mare, seeing the tension leave the man's shoulders. "His stance is wrong," a voice said beside him. Harlan smiled without looking. Cassidy hopped up onto the fence rail, sitting effortlessly. She wore a dusty Stetson and a vest embroidered with the center's logo. She looked like she had been born on this land. "He's learning," Harlan said. "Patience, girl. Not everyone breaks a colt in a day." "I did," she smirked. "You," Harlan chuckled, "are too much like your father." "And you," she countered, bumping his shoulder with hers, "are getting soft." Harlan looked out across the valley. He thought about the auction that never happened. He thought about Sarah, who was currently in the main house teaching a cooking class to the families of the veterans. The surgery had saved her heart, but the ranch had saved her life. He realized he hadn't checked the stock market in 3 years. He didn't know what his net worth was, and he didn't care. "You know," Harlan said quietly, looking at his granddaughter, "people used to tell me that land was the only legacy that mattered, that if you didn't own the dirt, you were nothing." Cassidy followed his gaze to the group of soldiers, to the healed families, to the community they had built from the ashes of his ego. "And now?" she asked. Harlan reached into his pocket and pulled out the old silver Zippo lighter. He flipped it open, the flame dancing in the wind, then snapped it shut. "Now I know," he said. "Land is just dirt. Legacy is who stands beside you when the sun goes down." He put the lighter back in his pocket and patted Cassidy's hand. "Come on," Harlan said, pushing himself off the fence. "That soldier is going to get stepped on if I don't show him how to hold the lead rope." "After you, Grandpa," Cassidy said. "The seasons in Montana do not ask for permission. They simply take what is theirs." Winter had come and gone 5 times since the night the auction gavel never fell, and the spring thaw had turned the creek beds into rushing veins of cold, clear water. On a ridge, overlooking the valley, far away from the bustle of the rehabilitation center where veterans were finding their footing, stood a small, wrought-iron fence enclosing 3 headstones. Harlan Vance walked the path up the hill. He walked slower these days, the cane no longer just an accessory, but a necessity. Yet his back remained straight. The stiffness in his gait was no longer born of pride, but of the honest work of a man who had returned to the saddle at 75. He reached the gate and unlatched it. The metal squeaked, a sound he kept meaning to oil but never did, perhaps because it reminded him that things were allowed to be imperfect. He stopped in front of the center stone. Austin Vance, beloved son. For 20 years, Harlan had come here with nothing but silence and shame. He would stand like a statue, unable to speak to the cold granite because he felt he had lost the right to the conversation. But today, he was not alone. "The mare foaled this morning," a voice came from behind him. Harlan didn't turn. He smiled at the stone. "Is she standing?" "Standing and nursing," Cassidy said, stepping up beside him. She held a travel mug of coffee, the steam rising into the crisp morning air. She was 24 now, the sharpness of her youth tempered by the steady rhythm of ranch life. But her eyes were still the same, green, gold, and unafraid. "Sarah says you're skipping breakfast again," Cassidy noted, taking a sip. "She threatened to bring the biscuits up here herself if you didn't come down." "Your mother," Harlan chuckled softly, "is a tyrant in the kitchen, a wonderful stubborn tyrant." "She learned from the best," Cassidy countered, bumping his shoulder gently. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching a hawk circle the thermals above the valley floor. Below them, the ranch was alive. It wasn't the quiet, sterile museum of wealth it had been under Bradley's management. It was messy and loud and real. There were trucks moving hay, the shouting of men learning to trust their bodies again, the smell of wood smoke and wet earth. "Do you think he'd recognize it?" Harlan asked suddenly, his voice quiet. He gestured to the land below. "Do you think Austin would recognize this place?" Cassidy looked down at the rehabilitation center, then at the grave, and finally at her grandfather. She saw the lines in his face that had softened, the hands that were calloused again, the way he looked at the world not as something to conquer, but something to tend. He wouldn't recognize the buildings, Cassidy said thoughtfully. He wouldn't know the new fencing or the paved roads. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old silver Zippo lighter. She turned it over in her fingers, the metal warm against her skin. "But he'd recognize the heart of it," she said. "He'd recognize that you finally stopped building fences to keep people out and started building tables to bring them in." She handed the lighter to Harlan. It was a ritual they had developed without ever speaking of it. Harlan took the lighter. He flicked it open, the flame struggling for a moment against the mountain breeze before catching, standing tall and bright. He held it there for a heartbeat, a small beacon against the vastness of the sky. "I missed a lot of years, Cassie," Harlan whispered, watching the flame. "I can't buy them back. No matter how many horses I train or how many checks I write for the center, those years are gone." "You can't buy the past," Cassidy agreed. She placed her hand over his, her fingers covering the hand that held the lighter. "But you're spending the present pretty well, Grandpa." Harlan snapped the lighter shut. The sound was a definitive click that signaled the end of mourning and the continuation of duty. He put the lighter in his breast pocket, right over his heart. "Let's go," Harlan said, turning away from the grave. "If I'm late for biscuits, your mother will have my hide, and I'm too old to be scolded by my daughter-in-law." "She's making gravy too," Cassidy warned, falling into step beside him. "Well then." Harlan picked up his pace, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the dirt path. "We'd best hurry." They walked down the hill together, leaving the dead to rest in peace and returning to the living who needed them. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist, illuminating the sign at the gate that no longer promised exclusivity, but offered something far more valuable. A second chance. We all have a little bit of Harlan in us, don't we? That stubborn voice that says, "I'm right," even when our heart whispers, "I'm lonely." Harlan Vance almost let his pride cost him the only family he had left. He learned the hard way that you can't hug a bank account, and you can't have a conversation with a deed to the land. So, I have a question for you today, and I'd really love to read your answers in the comments below. Is there a phone call you've been too stubborn to make? Or maybe a forgiveness you've been waiting to give? Share your story with us. Sometimes writing it down is the first step to healing. If this story touched your heart, please consider joining our community by hitting that subscribe button. We tell stories here that matter. And don't go anywhere, because the video on your screen right now, well, let's just say if you thought Cassidy's journey was emotional, wait until you hear what happened in this next story. Trust me, you don't want to miss it.